Over the last week or so, we have witnessed the sudden and spectacular collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. To discuss the implications of this collapse for Syria and the region as a whole, including Palestine especially, I'm joined today by Dr. Azzam Tamimi, political commentator and author. Dr. Azzam, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Dr. Azzam, we are still in the early stages of the end of the Assad regime in Syria. Please share with us your thoughts so far.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This has been one of the most pleasant surprises ever. It took us all by surprise, but it was something that many people around the Arab world, and most particularly the Syrians themselves, were praying for, were wishing for. And it has happened. This regime is one of the most brutal regimes, or used to be one of the most brutal regimes in the Arab world, even in the world really as a whole. It is a regime that perpetrated all sorts of war crimes against humanity in dealing with the Syrian people. As a result of the policies of this regime and its refusal to bring about certain reforms that people were asking for, half of the Syrian people were displaced, had to live in utter dispossession, whether within Syria or outside Syria. So the collapse of this regime is very good news for all the Syrians, or at least most Syrians, most Arabs, and most freedom-loving people around the world.
I want to get into the implications soon, but first I want to talk about the collapse that we witnessed over the last week and a half or so. We initially started seeing the Syrian, we call the Tahrir al-Sham, one of the Syrian opposition forces. After the Lebanese ceasefire agreement, or the Hezbollah ceasefire agreement with Israel, by a few hours or so, went out and declared their operation and stormed Aleppo. Now, the situation changed rapidly, but we saw many commentators avoid speaking about Syria for the last week and a half until things became a little bit clearer. Could you give us a little insight into why they may have done so?
Well, indeed, many people didn't want to talk about it at the time. And I remember when I was going to do my talk show, my weekly talk show, on the Thursday when the Syrian revolutionaries were taking over Aleppo and about to enter into Homs. They took Aleppo and Hama and were about to enter into Homs. I suggested to my guests in the talk show that let's talk about Syria, but some of them said things are unsure. We don't know really what to say. We have to wait and see what's likely to happen. So the fact that people were taken by surprise, it wasn't easy for people to comment on the events unfolding quite rapidly. But I heard from friends who were close to Syria or to the events in Syria at the time, and they said to me that although these developments took so many people around the world by surprise, the Syrian revolutionaries were actually preparing for their operation for the past 6 months. So apparently they could see since 6 months ago that there were major changes happening in the region that tilted the balance of power in their favor. Though, admittedly, they did not expect such a rapid collapse of the regime. They thought they were going probably to expand the areas in the north that were under their control in what is known as Free Syria. So they thought, okay, we will take a few square kilometers here, a few square kilometers here, etc. But then they discovered that the Syrian army was simply not in the mood of resisting. Many Syrian troops just left and abandoned the towns they were put in charge. And it seems to me that the major signal that these revolutionaries received was what happened to both Iran and Hezbollah, while at the same time Russia, the main protector of the Syrian regime, was really in the swamp of the Ukrainian war. And they probably read into all of this that the blows that Iran received, Hezbollah received, and the embroilment of the Russians in Ukraine combined together created an unprecedented opportunity for them. And this has really turned to be right. And they apparently they had a very good vision of what was to come.
Yeah, I guess the embodiment of your point about them not expecting the Syrian regime to collapse in such a way is the name of the operation, deterrence of aggression, clearly showing that they weren't intending to deal a fatal blow to the regime at the time. Now, many commentators and people who support the Palestinian cause have suspicions about the group HTS, about the intentions, and especially the timing of this offensive coming just after the Israelis, bombarded Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon and destroyed much of their capabilities. Do you have any comments on that kind of suspicion that's going around at the moment?
I wouldn't blame anybody who had misgivings about this, because first of all, the background of some of the factions that initiated this recent action was a bit dubious, and some were accused of being connected to Al-Qaeda in the past. And people saw some ugly things happen during the war that erupted after the Syrian revolution started. They saw all sorts of factions emerging, and some of these factions had very extreme radical ideologies. Some were connected to certain regimes here and there. So they didn't know really what to expect. At the same time, the supporters of Palestine generally do not are not, they don't have the capacity to see Syria as a different cause altogether. Many supporters of Palestine, especially on the left, spoke in terms of axes. So there was an axis of resistance that included Iran, Hezbollah, the Palestinian factions, and to some extent the Syrian regime. And on the other hand, the Zionist faction axis, which included Israel, the United States of America, and whoever supported Israel or collaborated with it in the region. And they failed to see that the Syrian people had a cause. They did really had a genuine cause, because this regime was very oppressive. It persecuted the people, it tormented them, and the people were genuinely seeking their freedom. They were seeking their dignity. So unfortunately, supporters of Palestine, or some of the supporters of Palestine, couldn't see this, and they judged whatever blow directed at any faction or any component of the resistance axis to be a conspiracy. So they emanated from conspiracy theory in assessing what was going on in Syria. And I remember I had many arguments with such people. I was trying to convince them that in as much as the Palestinians had the right to freedom from Zionism, the Syrian people had the right to struggle for freedom from this tyrannical regime, just like the Egyptians have the right to free themselves from the Sisi regime, just like many other Arab peoples who are ruled by such tyrants have equal rights to regain their freedom and dignity. So I think it was a combination of these things altogether.
In terms of the people of the Arab world at large working towards attaining their freedoms, we know that this revolution started in 2011 with what was essentially just protests for dignity and rights. They weren't initially aimed to overthrow the entire regime. But we saw through the years, the army split and people took arms, and we saw the situation in Syria get extremely messy, at least from particular viewpoints. Could you comment on the last 14 years in Syria, the kind of the evolution of the revolution, maybe the emotions of people watching, hoping for a positive outcome, and seeing it just gets so extremely messy?
Well, you are right in your introduction to this question that the Arab peoples who rose against tyranny didn't want to start wars. All they wanted was for these regimes to reform themselves or to be replaced by democratically elected governments, which is a basic human rights in modern times. Yet, regimes like the Syrian one, the Yemeni one, the Libyan one in particular, started bombing the people, started using massive firepower in order to deter people who were simply in the streets calling for democracy and respect for human rights. And I think in the case of Syria specifically, the Assad regime sought to militarize the revolution. It played a major role in turning the revolution into a military action in order to justify using sheer power against the people of Syria. And this is exactly what happened. We ended up seeing the Syrian regime use gas. It was gassing the people. You use barrel bombs dropped on innocent people in various towns and cities and villages, forcing people to leave their homes. And this was justified in the name of fighting terrorism or fighting extremism. And of course, what really aborted the Arab revolutions eventually is some sort of a consensus among regional powers as well as external powers to abort the march toward democratization in this part of the world. And we saw this begin with the toppling of the first democratically elected president in Egypt, President Mohammed Morsi, rahimahullah. And then we saw what happened. I mean, billions of dollars were pumped into these in the coffers of the ancient regimes or the old regimes to empower them and enable them to crush the revolutions. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates took the initiative to do this, and they were collaborated with by various international actors. Though initially the moves in late 2010, early 2011 were intended to peacefully bring about political and social reform.
Some commentators are comparing the recent operation by HTS to the Tufan al-Aqsa operation on the 7th of October 2023 by Hamas, in the sense that it was much more militarily successful than the organizers had ever imagined. Do you see that as being the case, and are there any other ways that these two operations may be connected?
Yes, I've seen this commentary. There are people who are comparing the two together. And yes, they are right in the sense that there were certain aspects of both operations that people might find parallels between them, such as the element of surprise. They existed in both of them. Surprise in terms of surprising the enemy, as well as being surprised yourself that the enemy was not ready to resist, and that meant achieving a lot more than you were bargaining for. But it's too early, really, to make a final judgment. We'll see what is likely to happen. I think in the case of Syria, the results are most unlikely to look like Gaza. I think the Syrian people as a whole will welcome this change. The regional powers will most probably try to accommodate it rather than go to war against the will of the Syrian people. And I'm encouraged by the rhetoric we hear from the leaders of this liberation movement, if I may call it so. They talk about rule of law. They talk about uniting the Syrians. They talk about reversing all sectarian privileges and sectarian discriminations. They've urged people not to undermine the country in any way, not to engage in looting or in any crime. I'm really encouraged by this. I mean, of course, the other major difference that people will see between the Gazan situation and the Syrian situation is that here you don't have a Zionist occupation. You had a tyrannical regime that is now gone. And it is up to the Syrian people how they are going to build their future. And I hope that they will cooperate together and focus on rebuilding their lives rather than preoccupy themselves with a tit for tat or any sort of vendetta.
We heard of many backdoor dealings, if I could call it that, between the HTS group and the outgoing Assadist regime, especially, for example, with the Prime Minister. Or at least today, he was in meetings with the rebels in sort of a way to hand over power. Do you have any insights into what kind of conversations were going on behind the scenes through your communications with your friends in Syria and the opposition? Do you know any details, for example, of how Bashar was able to make it out?
I don't really have any insider information. I just heard that they're doing this in order to maintain the institutions of the country. These institutions belong to the Syrian people, and since the tyrant is gone, the bureaucracy that he leaves behind is a Syrian bureaucracy, and it can be reformed. It can be gradually improved. Some aspects of it probably replaced, and therefore, rather than just throw everything out, you try and work with the people who have been running the government for a better future. And I think this is very wise. It's a very wise decision.
Now, one thing that many commentators, especially those who support Bashar al-Assad, have been warning of is the potential for Syria to fall into the same issues that Libya fell into, where many foreign actors aided certain groups in order to take control of certain things and create essentially a failed state. Have you heard or seen any indications that foreign actors are ready to attempt to do the same thing in Syria? And what can the Syrian people do to avoid the same fate as Libya?
We're recording this conversation just less than 24 hours after the collapse of the regime. And therefore, we can only judge on the basis of what we're seeing. Apparently, things are smooth, are quiet. People are adhering to the instructions given to them. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there are external as well as regional players who will try and sabotage the current process. Now, whether they succeed or not, it really depends on the Syrian people themselves. If the Syrians act in a united fashion, and if they focus on rebuilding their lives and rebuilding their country, and if they prevent any plotters from undermining this great liberation success, then everything will be okay. But we should not be naive. I mean, there are people who hate to see the Syrian people regain their freedom and dignity and establish a democratically elected government. So there will always be people who will plot and who will seek to undermine this success.
In terms of democracy in Syria, the main group which created the situation in which the Assad regime collapsed, HTS, is a nominally Islamist group, and they, well, at least Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of this group, has not spoken openly about democracy as of yet. Do you think that democracy, with groups like HTS being at the forefront of the liberation, do you think democracy is possible, and is it even advised at this stage? Is that the best possible solution at this time?
Well, I think the Syrian people will need some time to rebuild their lives, at least in the initial stages. They've suffered a lot. They've been tormented for decades. I mean, this regime has been suffocating them for 50 years, nearly 50 years. What we heard so far from Ahmed al-Shara and from others who spoke is very promising. We can only advise, if our advice is sought, that a representative government of the people of Syria is the best compensation for all the suffering they endured during the past 5 decades. But it's really now, it's too early to talk about any of this. And we just hope and make dua and pray for the Syrian people to be able to go back to their country. Remember, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, actually, there are millions of Syrian refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Europe, in Iraq, in so many places. And these people need to go back to their home. And in order for this to happen, the country needs to be safe and secure. And there has to be some sort of rule of law so that no one repeats the crimes that used to be perpetrated by the defunct regime.
I don't know if you've seen these images floating around on the internet, but I've seen Zionist propaganda channels spreading a map of Syria split into 3, where the coast is controlled by the Alawites or the minorities of that region. Then a portion of Syria in the center is controlled by the Sunnis, and then there's like kind of a corridor on the south connecting the Julan area of occupied Syria to the Kurdish controlled or the SDP controlled Kurdish dominated areas in the north. And we saw today explosions in Damascus, which are attributed to the Israelis, as well as what I heard is an invasion to create some sort of buffer zone. Do you think the Israelis have a good chance of making this vision a reality?
The Israelis and some others in the West do wish to carve Syria and create these mini states within the country. As I told you earlier, what I have heard so far from Ahmed al-Shara and from other spokespersons of this liberation campaign is very good discourse, is very good rhetoric. It is one that is reassuring to every member of the Syrian community, irrespective of their ethnicity, irrespective of their affiliation to this sect or to that sect, or to this religion or to that religion. And I think they are capable of making it more difficult for the Israelis and their allies to split Syria into such assumed entities. Only a few weeks ago, the Israelis were talking about a Druze state in the region, a Kurdish state in the region, and all sorts of things. That's always a colonial ambition. I think the people can prevent this if they have the proper understanding and the willingness to unite their efforts in order to foil all such conspiracies.
Now, in terms of regional support for the establishment of a free Syria, or rather for the revolution, we saw two main players who have been most supportive of the revolution in Syria: the Qataris and the Turks. Although in recent years Erdogan seems to have attempted to normalize with Assad in some way, the Qataris voted against readmitting Assad into the Arab Summit, and seemed they had very cool or non-existent relations with Assad for this entire time. What would you say kept these two players on the side of the revolution in their ways, and have they, in a sense, won or succeeded and come out victorious from these decisions?
Well, since the very early days of the Arab revolutions, both Qatar and Turkey stood by the people of the region. Yes, it is true that they could not all the time maintain the same level of support because of pressure, because of conspiracies hatched against them. Remember, there was a coup attempt in Turkey. There was a coup attempt in Qatar, an invasion attempt of Qatar. But Turkey in particular, of course, I don't know how involved Turkey has been in the recent events, but Turkey has an interest in resolving the Syrian problem. And as we heard Erdogan say, he tried with Assad, and Assad was adamant. He refused to reconcile with anybody, with any other faction. And therefore, apparently, Assad signed his own death certificate. He didn't want to move on, to allow the Syrians back. And probably the Turks are rejoicing now that this is happening. We can expect at any time that the majority of the Syrians who are refugees in Turkey will want to go back home. And that will unburden Turkey in some respect. So Qatar and Turkey, unlike any other party in the region, have been more truthful in their positions, have been more sincere in their support for desire of the peoples to be free and to be dignified.
What's interesting about the relationships between, the regional powers and Syria is that a lot of commentators and maybe leaders as well were attempting to supposedly combat the Iranian influence of in Syria, sorry. And these same leaders who supposedly are trying to combat Iranian influence have turned around and normalized in a way with Iran, with the Saudis. And in fact, the Emiratis were attempting to save Assad from his fate by normalizing relations with America in a way. Could you comment on the other Arab regimes' relationship to Assad and the revolution, and what it means that their stances change depending on their circumstances?
Well, I think the Saudis and the Emiratis were never truthful about supporting the Arab revolutions in any country. And only recently, The Guardian, a few days ago, actually, said that today Assad, in his when he was actually in his final days, we didn't know he was in his final days, that the Guardian said that in the region he is today supported more by the Saudis and the Emiratis than by anybody else. And it mentioned the fact that the Emiratis were talking to the Americans to convince them to remove sanctions against the Syrian regime so as to empower it sufficiently to deter the revolutionaries who were marching from the north. Now, all other Arab regimes were not happy to see the revolutions anywhere, whether they liked Assad or didn't like Assad, whether they liked Gaddafi or didn't like Gaddafi. They believed that their common enemy, and they shared that enemy with Israel, by the way, because they and Israel ended up being in the same camp, that their enemy was those revolutions that wanted to change the status quo. And they were all after preserving the status quo. And that's why they readmitted Assad to the Arab League. So I am sure that tonight many of these Arab leaders in the neighborhood are having nightmares in their sleep, if they can sleep at all, because what happened in Syria is likely to happen in their own countries, because none of these Arab leaders are respectful of the people they are ruling. They don't respect them at all, actually. They humiliate them, they oppress them, they deny them their basic rights, and they and their close relatives and their own entourage keep stealing the wealth of the nation. So now they see that what they're doing to their people did not help Assad remain in power, and that the people eventually rose and toppled him. And the same fate is likely to be met by many of these Arab leaders.
Now, a very important question that is being asked right now is, how does this affect Palestine? The Iranians were supporting or sending supplies through to Hezbollah through Syria. Hezbollah was in an all-out war with Israel until recently, but it could flare up at any time. And it is seen as a major blow to the so-called axis of resistance that Assad is gone. What are the implications for the fronts that are supporting Palestine, Gaza specifically, at this time? And what are the implications for the Palestine cause at large?
Now, look, Syria is a destroyed country. Syria is a country that needs to be rebuilt. Syria is a country, half of its population are exiled, and they need to come back. Therefore, on the short to medium term, the Syrians will focus on this issue, on this business. Now, long term, Allah alone knows what's likely to happen. I don't think that in the short or medium term, the recent events in Syria and the change we have seen will have an immediate impact on Palestine, apart probably from uplifting the morale of the Palestinians, because I'm sure that most Palestinians would welcome what happened in Syria, because the Syrians are their brothers and they were oppressed just like the Palestinians themselves are being oppressed by the Zionists. Now, eventually, the Zionists must understand, and the supporters of Zionism must understand, that no true Muslim on the face of the earth would recognize the legitimacy of Zionism. No Muslim on the face of the earth would recognize the legitimacy of the occupation of Palestine, of the first Qibla of the Muslims. And that must be taken as a given. And that's why I always prefer to talk about these causes in the current period as slightly distinct issues. Of course, in the overall picture, it's all part of the Ummah and what the Ummah is going through. Of course, the Iranian support for the Palestinians and Hezbollah support for the Palestinians was realistic. No one can deny it, really, because it was there. Yet, unfortunately, both the Iranians and Hezbollah did not see the plight of the people of Syria, in as much as they did not even see the plight of the Arab masses anywhere else. They were primarily focused on their own cause. Of course, you have a cause and you're defending it and you're working for it, but you must also understand and appreciate that other people have also their own causes. So rather than develop a good relationship with the peoples of the region, the Iranians and Hezbollah developed good relations with the tormentors, or with some of the tormentors of these peoples. And that was a fatal mistake. And Hezbollah today is in a very bad shape. The Iranians are not in a good shape as well. And I think much of what the Iranians built in the region is likely to collapse gradually, simply because they were very selfish in their outlook, and they forgot that they themselves in 1979 toppled a tyrannical regime and rebuilt their lives, and they denied the same right to the people of Syria, to the people of Egypt, and to other peoples in the region.
Yeah, in terms of the Iranian support for the regime, it's said by multiple people that without the Iranian support, without Hezbollah being on the ground, that the Assad regime would have fallen years ago. So it's seen as though the Iranians put all of their eggs in the Assad basket, so to speak. Is this not a major blow to the Iranians? And if so, why didn't they fight harder to help Assad keep his grip?
Indeed, the Iranians made a bet, they bargained, and they lost the bargain. And the Iranians tried to act as a regional superpower with little respect for the rights of the people of the region. Yes, the regime relied on their support heavily, but I think there was a time when the regime could have still fallen despite the support of Iran and Hezbollah, had it not been for the intervention of the Russians. So the Russians, at a later stage, I think from 2015 onwards, became more important for the regime in Syria than the Iranians and Hezbollah. but many observers are talking today about the fact that the blows dealt to Hezbollah were a major incentive for the people who planned the recent offensive that ended up with the collapse of the regime. I'm not talking here just about the war that Israel launched on Lebanon, but also the security breach that Hezbollah suffered and resulted in major losses. Some commentators even believe that Hezbollah only suffered such security breaches because of its because it spread its wings widely, and because of its intervention in Syria, that most probably its infiltration came from the Syrian side. So I really regret to say that Hezbollah lost the gamble, the Iranians lost the gamble, and some of the peoples of the region will continue to have a very, very bad impression of both sides.
On a final note, Dr. Azzam, the Arab dictators and other dictators as well may have pointed to Syria over the last decade or so and used it to threaten the masses and to keep them silent, fear-mongering, and telling them, is this what you want to happen to you? Now, on the eve of this major change in Syria, are we potentially witnessing a new Arab Spring?
I hope so. I really, truly hope so. And I've always believed that there was going to be a second round. That we had the first round in 2010, 2011. It was aborted, and we are likely to have a second round. It is very likely that the recent success in Syria will pave the way for another eruption. I remember recently I interviewed the former Tunisian president, Monsef al-Marzouki, and he actually used this expression. He said, the Arab world is like a volcano. It's like a volcano that is about to erupt, and the next eruption is going to be unlike any previous one, a devastating one.
Dr. Azzam Tamimi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.